Hi, my name's Saya Harvey. I teach 4 of the modules on the Beta Conservation course at the Allerton Trust. And today actually we're on my farm, because I farm a small arable farm just down the road from the Allerton Trust. And I'm going to be talking about agri-environment options and species that are associated with those, and also IPM. So we're here in an area of wild flowers, and this is in the Countryside Stewardship option AB8. Nice wide margin here, which has actually developed over a number of years. So we've had this margin in grass options and for at least 30 years, and over that time we've managed it, and the floristic diversity has really developed, so it actually now qualifies for a wildflower option. Now obviously if you're going into a countryside stewardship scheme as a new scheme, then a wildflower option has to be seeded, and you buy wildflower seed, but over the years floristic diversity can develop. Right, so in this margin we've got a really good mixture of species. So there's knapweed, it's not come into flower yet, but it's just about to. We've got red clover, we've got alsaiki clover, there's white clover as well. And then 3 or 4 different vetches, so field vetch and common vetch and bird's foot trefoil. So lots of kind of the really valuable species for bees and other pollinators. We've also got quite a lot of umbellifery species, hogweed, cow parsley and yarrow, plantain, all sorts of things like that. So those are all of the species that are recommended within countryside stewardship in the AB8 option, and actually are very common in this part of the world, so have actually come in naturally, so that's really nice. One of the things that we're really starting to think about now on the farm is integrated pest management, and very much trying to reduce insecticide use. And we've got a field of beans here, and one of the common pests in beans is bruchid beetle, which is something that can be sprayed quite regularly throughout the flowering season of the beans, and that obviously has a huge impact on pollinators in the crop. So we haven't used insecticide in our beans for 3 years now, and we think we're not getting too much damage on the bean crop from bruchid beetle, and we think that a lot of that is to do with the margins and the flower rich strips that we've got around the farm, bringing in predators of bruchid beetle. We haven't really tested that, but you know, that is one of the theories. So some of the other pests, aphids, for example, cabbage stem flea beetle in oilseed rape, the problem there is resistance to insecticide, and so we're really trying to avoid using insecticide to control either of those pests, and we found a massive difference with the wildflower mixes and grass strips that we've got on the farm in terms of crop beneficials controlling those pests. So one of the serious pests of beans is bruchid beetle, and actually the threshold for bruchid beetle is nothing to do with whether you've got bruchid beetle in the crop or not. It's to do with temperature. So if you have 3 days over 20 degrees, 3 consecutive days over 20 degrees, then traditionally you would go out and spray the crop for bruchid, and then after 7 days, if that threshold is reached again, then you would go out and spray it again. So potentially you could spray a bean crop 2 or 3 or 4 times in a season, which obviously is going to have an impact on the pollinators in the crop. So it's not something that we're keen to do. So I've actually been trying to monitor the crop for bruchid beetle, and if you have a white tray, you can shake it in the bean crop and shake out the insects that are there, and have a look for bruchid beetle. It actually doesn't appear to be anything in the crop at the moment. The beans are sort of coming to the end of flowering, so it's unlikely that there'll be any bruchid in here now. but there is evidence of bruchid in that there are some eggs on the bean pods, but you always get a little bit of that. But this is just an example really of how a little bit more careful thought and thinking about IPM can allow you to reduce the use of insecticide on the farm. Okay, so this is a grass margin, 4 metre grass margin, which is SW1 in countryside stewardship. And that of course goes near a hedgerow or a ditch, and that actually makes an extremely valuable habitat, because you've got the shrub and that sort of structure there with the hedgerow, and then immediately adjacent to it some nice rough grass, and if you've got cow parsley or hogweed in the margin as well, then that provides a great nectar source, pollen and nectar source, and it is really very valuable for quite a lot of crop beneficials. So for example, hoverflies are it's like a superfood for hoverflies. It's one of their favourite foods, and also quite a lot of parasitic wasps that prey on pests are associated with umbellifery species. So really good from an IPM point of view, but also fantastic for hedgerow birds as well, because it provides that kind of dense structure at the base of the hedge, which is so important for many of those nesting birds. So for example, yellowhammer will nest right in the bottom of the hedge there, probably almost in the grass, if not just in the bottom of the hedge. So yeah, it provides that kind of two aspects of the habitat that's so important. Whitethroats also really like that kind of habitat. In terms of managing the hedgerow for birds, there's many different birds that like many different things, just like human beings. And if you can get some structural diversity in your hedgerows on the farm, then that can be really valuable. So this hedge here is perfect for yellowhammers, and I just heard a yellowhammer singing in the background because it's actually relatively short and there's not too many trees, and that's just the sort of the habitat that yellowhammer like. But for example, bullfinch, that species would prefer a much bigger, more blousy hedge, and potentially less trees. Tree sparrow, of course, they like trees. So a good variety of different types of hedges, large hedges, small hedges, well-trimmed hedges that are trimmed every year, and hedges that aren't, that are trimmed every 2 or 3 years. A good mixture of those around the farm can be really valuable for a wide range of bird species. So this is a new woodland that we planted about 20 years ago, and you can see here there's some quite small trees, but this is a result of ash dieback. So we actually had to take out most of the ash that we originally planted and replant those with other species, other native species, and we got a tree health grant to help us to do that. But the bulk of the woodland has been in for 20 years. We planted it because we've got a wood fuel heating system on the farm, so the thinnings we actually take out and chip up and use for heating on the farm. And actually the brash that's left that isn't really worth chipping, we've left in the rows in the woodland to provide a little bit of habitat and some cover as well for some of the woodland species. And there's quite a lot of pheasants and hares and things that use this woodland. The woodland is essentially native species, and we've planted them in coops, but then we've also got kind of round the edges and smaller areas of sort of shrubs that have been planted to bring in berries and more flower diversity as well. So we've got lots of hawthorn, lots of guelder rose, dogwood, and some of the kind of native shrub species. So before we did the thinning work in this woodland, it was actually getting really quite the ground flora was not very diverse, and there really wasn't very much going on the ground. So we've thinned out the trees, and we took out about 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 of the trees to open up the canopy to let some sunlight in and to try and promote the ground flora. The aim really is to get really good structural diversity in the woodland. We want a canopy, but we also want some sub-canopy species, and we also want some sort of scrub and shrub plants growing in the woodland. When we planted the woodland, we didn't think about it quite like that, and we don't have many shrub species growing within the plantation, but actually the opportunity with ash dieback has allowed us to put some shrub species into the middle of the woodland to bring more structural diversity within the woodland. So we wanted to introduce some shrubs actually into the main area of the woodland, which we didn't originally do in the original planting 20 years ago. But luckily there's quite a lot of hawthorn coming in naturally, and dogrose, but we have planted some dogwood and guelder rose and hazel as well, and kind of mixed that in to the main areas of planting to bring some structural diversity, so that we've got a canopy and then a sub-canopy and then the scrub area and then some hopefully really good ground vegetation. I think it'll be a long time before we see wild garlic and bluebells, but I am trying to introduce those as sort of indicators of native ground flora in woodland. So planning a new woodland, the planting of a new woodland is actually a really exciting opportunity, and that traditionally you might plant the trees in rows like this has been planted, but there's quite a lot of examples, really exciting examples of where people have done something a little bit different. So for example, planting in a spiral so that you can still access the rides and do the cutting and the weed control, but if you look at the woodland from the outside, it looks like a completely natural mix of trees growing. So really think about the way that you actually achieve the planting, because rows like this isn't necessarily the look of a native woodland. So there's lots of opportunities to actually be quite innovative with woodland planting. So rides are really, really important in woodland, and they give the opportunity for a different kind of habitat and also some shrubs near the rides. And so when you start out, the ideal width for a ride is maybe something that you can get a vehicle down. But of course, as the trees start to grow, then actually the ideal width for the ride is the height of the tree next to the ride. So we're going to really have to start thinking about thinning out and taking out some of the trees alongside this ride now, because ultimately it's going to become a very shaded habitat, and really the whole point of a ride is to let some sunlight in and to have pollinators and flowers growing on the shrubs, and have that kind of habitat. Really, really brilliant for butterflies as well. So leaving dead wood in woodland is really, really important habitat. This is a log pile but we've decided to leave it here. And actually within the Sustainable Farming Incentive woodland standard, there's a requirement to leave 20% of any timber that's felled or taken out of the woodland actually still in the woodland, and that's probably a higher percentage than that. And we've got the brash tops in between the rows, which would probably more than meet that requirement. But actually this kind of pile is also really, really important for things like hedgehogs and small mammals, but also potentially solitary bees and things like that might be using this kind of habitat. So this is a hedge that we planted about 20 years ago, and it's got 7 or 8 different species in there. So there's dogwood, there's hawthorn, and actually we've got a variety of hawthorn around here called Midland hawthorn, which is also in this hedge. And then we've got some field maple down there, and there's also blackthorn in here as well, and dog rose and dogwood, and lots of different species. But you can see this hedge is much taller than the one we looked at earlier, and actually we do have a nesting pair of bullfinch in this hedge, and they do definitely prefer this kind of taller, bushier hedge. So we actually only cut this hedge once every 3 years. And we've actually got some hedges on the farm that we cut every 2 years or 3 years on one side, but we cut every year on the other side to give that diversity, structural diversity, within quite a small area on the farm. Okay, so wild birdseed mix. This is an example of a 2-year wild birdseed mix. So it's got, this is the 2nd year, so it's mainly kale. But last year it had quinoa in it, linseed, and a couple of different radish varieties as well. So, I mean, great option for birds, and we've got all sorts of birds using this, from reed buntings to tree sparrows, yellowhammer, chaffinch. There's all sorts of birds popping in and out of the hedge and using this. And actually in the winter as well, flocks of sort of the winter migrants in this area as well, so fieldfares and things like that. But it can cause real problems, and certainly we've had quite a lot of problems on the farm here with blackgrass coming into a 2-year mix. And actually that's what's happened here. I've had some unacceptably high density of blackgrass in some of this wild birdseed mix, so I've actually sprayed it out and established a different kind of annual wild birdseed mix in the area just here. And actually, as a habitat, as a crop to establish and manage, wild birdseed mix is quite costly. The payment for the option is £640 a hectare, but actually you do use that up quite quickly with the mix. You have to apply fertiliser, about 50 or 60 kilograms per hectare per year of nitrogen. And then if you've got to do hand roguing of blackgrass, or you've got to re-establish areas like I have here, then you soon eat up that £640. So these grass buffers or watercourse buffers are really, really brilliant options for creating connectivity around the farm. So you can have a 4 to 6 metre margin along a hedgerow, or anything from a 6 metre to 12 or 24 metre margin along watercourses. And that provides a great opportunity to create those corridors around the farm that are just so important for wildlife. So things like barn owls, bats use these corridors, and mammals getting around the landscape, and of course a buffer alongside the hedge for birds as well. And if you do nothing else in terms of agri-environment, then actually creating corridors is extremely valuable. And also buffering existing habitats and existing features on the farm. So really got a good opportunity to do that without having the pressure of actually establishing wildflowers or pollen and nectar, which might be a bit more tricky to do and require a little bit more management. This is a supplementary feeder for feeding birds during the winter, and this is an option in countryside stewardship that you link with wild birdseed mix. So we've got our new wild birdseed mix here that was drilled about a week ago, and hopefully is going to come up shortly. And then by December, there's very little seed left in that wild birdseed mix. So we start feeding the birds out of this feeder. It's looking in a bit of a sorry state because we've got squirrels around here and they try and get in to eat the seed. So I'm going to need to get a new one by the winter time next year. And the reason why we've got that here is basically because we've got a tree sparrow colony in these trees along here. We have found that colony has expanded quite considerably since we located the wild birdseed mix here. So that's been a really fantastic kind of win for the farm. So this is an example of the supplementary feed mix that we feed, and it's got sunflowers in there, it's got millet, linseed, buckwheat, and we mix some of our own wheat into this as well, and sometimes oilseed rape if we've got that available. And then we feed that every week throughout the winter from the beginning of December until the end of April, which is the required for that option within Countryside Stewardship. And it is absolutely fantastic. I mean, the birds here in this hedgerow during the winter are amazing. We have yellowhammers and chaffinch. We had bramlings this year, tree sparrows, linnets, all sorts of things. There's a real mixture, and they're just ducking and diving out of the hedge onto that feeder. And then we also scatter the seed along the margin here and on the bridge over there, and the birds just absolutely love it. Okay, so when you're putting together an agri-environment scheme, Countryside Stewardship and potentially SFI or local nature recovery going forward, the kind of important starting point is really to protect existing habitats. So for example, your hedgerows are existing and very, very important, valuable habitats. So providing protection for those and the ditches is kind of the first step. And then building on that. So protecting existing habitats, then connecting habitats. That's the sort of next step to take, and providing connectivity around the farm and corridors. And then you can start to think about the additional habitats supplying food for different types of wildlife throughout the year. So pollen and nectar, or wildflowers, of course, is sort of a nectar source in the summer, but it's also incredibly rich, diverse source of insects for birds. So that's providing that really kind of summer food for a whole range of different wildlife. And then you've got to think about the winter food supply. So just here we've got an area that's going to be wild birdseed mix, and that is obviously supplying food for birds in the winter and potentially for brown hares as well. So some mammals will be using that. But in terms of food for invertebrates and things in the winter, then actually extending the flowering period of wildflower mixes and pollen and nectar mixes is a good way of achieving that. And you can do that by cutting half of it in the spring. So then the flowering period is extended. So it's all about thinking about these resources throughout the year and making sure that there's food throughout the year. And then, of course, importantly, nesting and overwintering habitat is also really important. So that's where you go back to your hedges for birds and this kind of tussocky grass, which is really, really important for mammals, but also for some invertebrates. Bumblebees, many bumblebee species will nest underground. So tussocky grass margins are really important for that as well. So it's just thinking about making sure that you've got those resources throughout the year. And then you can start to build on that as well, thinking about IPM and thinking about crop beneficials, and maybe creating new habitats like species-rich grassland or something like that. But that really is the icing on the cake. If you can protect your existing habitats and provide connectivity and provide resources for wildlife throughout the year, then you're really going to be contributing a huge amount to biodiversity on farmland. So low input grassland is really valuable kind of habitat within the landscape, and we've got a really good example here. This is actually the site of a scheduled ancient monument, and it's a series of monastic fish ponds. So there's one of the fish ponds there that's been restored, and there's 3 more which actually have silted up now, but they're sort of boggy wetland areas. And then there's associated earthworks, so you can see some siltation channels around the pond, and in fact the hill behind me was the sacred garden for the monastery, so it's very, very historic, and actually we still retain the church, which was a secular part of the monastery in the village, which is now the village church. But these fields are within countryside stewardship in the GS2 option, and that's a payment for low input grassland, but really the payment is very low compared to the value of this kind of habitat in the landscape. It's not particularly valuable for any key species, it's not particularly floristically diverse, and there's no really key bird species, but a wide range of species will use it. So there's a lot of starlings feeding on this grassland area, and we have snipe in the winter on the sort of wet, boggy areas, and we have had curlew in the past, although not recently. So one of the really big management issues on this grassland is the thistles and the nettles, and within the scheme we aren't able to blanket spray these fields, and of course we'd struggle to do that anyway because of the earthworks and the fact that it's a scheduled monument. So we have to do quite a lot of spot spraying with knapsack sprayer, and also maybe some topping as well, to try and control the thistles if they start to get out of hand. But of course a few thistles is quite good for wildlife as well.